Hello, everyone. I can see that we still have people joining this webinar, but we are going to start it now. And I would really like to start by welcoming everyone who's joined us today. My name is Rachel Riley from the Global Detention Project. And you can see the other panelists on the screen who will be joining us for this event today. We're absolutely so grateful to so many of you and the interest that you've shown in this event and the range of participation. We have over 150 participants joining us today from all regions of the world, from over 40 different countries. We have representatives from governments, national human rights institutions and human rights ombudsmen, civil society organizations, lawyers, practitioners, academic institutions, UN agencies and foundations. So we would warmly like to welcome you all and thank you for your interest in this event. Myself and Mario, give a wave, are the co-hosts for today's event, and I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping logistics. So we have two open channels for communication. One is the chat. We'd like to invite you to use the chat to introduce yourselves and your organizations. If you have any technical issues with the webinar, please address them to Mario and myself as the co-hosts, and we will try to manage those. The other channel is the Q&A, which we will keep exclusively for questions. And we'd like you to use only the Q&A for questions. There will be two opportunities for you to ask questions. The webinar is going to be in two sections. So after we've heard from Sir Malcolm Evans and Hinpal Bui, there will be an opportunity for you to ask those two speakers questions in the chat. We'll have about 20 minutes. And then when we've heard from our 5 representatives from different NPMs, there will be another 30 minutes for you to ask those speakers questions. When you're writing your question, we ask you please give your name and your organization, and if you wish, your title as well. And if your question is addressed to an individual speaker, please indicate that in your question so that we can direct the question to that speaker. If you prefer to ask a question orally, you can also use the function of raising your hand on the screen, and we will call you. But just to let you know, we will give priority to the questions written in the Q&A. And we have a lot of participants, so we will also try and give an opportunity for a range of different speakers from different regions and different kinds of organizations to pose questions. Please try and keep your questions short and to the point so that we can maximize participation. At the end of this event, we will be circulating a recording. So this event is being recorded, and also the participants list. If you haven't actually registered for the event, I don't have your email address and you won't receive those. So if you want to receive those, please make sure that you do just send me an email to register so that I have your contact details. And if you don't want your name on the participants list, please also inform me of that. That's my introduction. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Flynn, who's the Executive Director of the Global Detention Project and who's going to open this event. So thank you and enjoy this webinar.
Thank you for that introduction, Rachel, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to reiterate my enthusiasm, reiterate Rachel's enthusiasm for this event. The response we have gotten has been enormous, and we have an excellent slate of speakers ahead of us, so I'm very excited about this. I wanted to just put a couple issues on the table as we get started, one of which is about what the Global Detention Project is doing here, what is the webinar, and also to present a couple challenges that I would like us to keep in mind as we listen to the different speakers today. So first of all, this is the Global Detention Project's 3rd webinar in a series of webinars that are aimed at building stronger connections between the work of local civil society organizations and international human rights instruments. Our first webinar was with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, And then the last one we had was with the UN Committee on Migrant Workers. Today's webinar, in contrast to those other two, is somewhat different because the instrument we're talking about, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, has two levels at it. It's got an international level monitoring body, which is the SPT, which we'll hear about in a little bit, and it has a local entity aspect to it, which are the National Preventive Mechanisms. And we're going to hear about both of these things. So there is this local and international connection inherent to today's webinar. So why is the GDP doing this? What is the nature of the webinar? Why are we hosting these? So our work, we're a small Geneva-based nonprofit research organization that has as a core agenda pushing back against harmful immigration detention and abuses that people suffer when they're in custody for immigration-related reasons. And one aspect, one way in which we work to prevent or push back against harmful practices is to work with local partners around the world to develop very good data and analysis about the detention regimes that they work on, and to bring that information to the awareness, to the attention of monitoring bodies working at the regional and international levels. Here's where the webinar fits in, because the webinars provide us an opportunity to learn and hear from these different experts at the international and regional levels about their work. And at the same time, it provides us and our partners the opportunity to raise awareness with these monitoring bodies of key issues that they face in their work trying to assist people in immigration detention. So what I see today's webinar, where it is situated, is rather problematic. It actually begins with the name of the webinar, the role of OPCAT in preventing harmful migration-related detention. And so the first question that we need to address here is, what are we talking about when we think about immigration detention? Because to some extent, if we're talking about preventing harms in migration-related detention, we may have to talk about not preventing harms in detention, but preventing that detention in the first place. Because a growing number of international experts and bodies, including the World Health Organization, now argue that there's something inherently harmful about immigration detention itself. And so how is it that we can position the work of monitoring bodies, which are aimed at preventing harms in detention, to actually preventing detention itself? And it's something that falls outside the scope of most of these monitoring bodies. And this is something that we can see, for example, in the work of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which is the detention monitoring body that works set up within the scope of the Council of Europe, which since the 1990s has been visiting immigration detention centers all across the member states of the Council of Europe. And invariably, in the reports that they produce about immigration detention, rather than discussing issues related to should you be placing asylum seekers, undocumented migrants in detention, they talk about how can you improve that. Thus, for instance, if they visit a country that is using a prison, a criminal prison for immigration detention, they encourage that country to build a better facility or a facility specially designed for immigration detention purposes. At the same time that they've been promoting this agenda, which, let's be clear, is a critical issue that we must advocate for, that people, whenever they're in custody, must be treated humanely and properly. However, one of the unintended consequences of this kind of advocacy could be that we see more detention today, because hand in hand, side by side with this effort to promote better immigration detention, we've seen more immigration detention. We've seen these systems grow, mature, become more specialized and more ingrained institutionally in countries where the CPT is active, so in the Council of Europe. So the challenge I think we face today is, how can we see or position the work of national preventive mechanisms in not only preventing harms in detention, but to encourage states to use it less? Is there a way that we can imagine that work to be positioned so that the states are not encouraged, but rather discouraged from using this mechanism? The second challenge I see, it relates to the fact of something inherent in immigration detention. And that is the fact that, in contrast to prisons, which in most countries are at least nominally intended to prepare people to re-enter societies, immigration detention, for the most part, is used as a convenience measure by states to help ensure that people are removed from society permanently, not to help them enter society, re-enter society, but to disappear them in a manner of speaking. So I think that there's an important point that we need to keep in mind when we think about human rights monitoring of immigration detention, this point in particular, because I think it may create a real challenge in trying to get states to adopt and implement in a sustainable way reforms. And a case in point is a recent body of work that the Global Detention Project has done on behalf for the World Health Organization, looking at a global, but basically it's a global evidence review of indicators concerning health and immigration detention. And this study is going to come out later in the year, so I won't get into the details of the study, but one thing that became clear as we did the research was that although monitoring bodies like NPMs, like the CPT, have consistently called for reforms related to health and the healthcare provided in detention centers, repeatedly, over a period of time, you'll see reforms either be ignored, or if they're implemented, they soon disappear. So these same monitoring bodies find themselves asking for the same things over and over again. And I wonder if that may be related to an apathy on the state of officials when they look at the people that they have in detention. They're people that aren't intended to return to their societies, but really they're people that are meant to be gone. And so does that quandary present a challenge for us and how we want to work with civil society, with NPMs, and ensuring that reforms are made? How can we think about it? How can we overcome apathy when we find it? So those are the two challenges I would like just to put on the table as we get started. But with that, I'm going to hand over the moderation of this event to Veronica Filippeschi, who's from another Geneva-based NGO, the Association for the Prevention of Torture, which has a long and distinguished relationship to both OPCAT and the NPMs, which I'm sure Veronica will tell you a little bit about. But again, I hope you find this an informative and useful webinar, and I look forward to hearing the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank the Global Detention Project for inviting me to moderate this event. I'm very happy about that. My name is Veronica Filippeschi, as Mike said, and I'm the Senior Advisor on Vulnerabilities and Policy at the Association for the Prevention of Torture. I would just like to spend 1 minute to introduce you to the APT, my organization, and why. So to just explain a bit why we are here moderating this event. So the APT is an international NGO based in Geneva, which we can say is at the origin of the OPCAT revolutionary idea, namely to have an international binding instrument establishing a system of regular, independent, and unannounced visits to places of deprivation of liberty. So at the APT, we advocate for the ratification of this treaty worldwide, but we also work very closely with the OPCAT bodies, the National Preventive Mechanisms, and the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, but also with state authorities, national human rights institutions, and civil society to prevent torture and other forms of ill treatment, including in immigration detention contexts. So this includes advocating for the use of migration or migration-related detention only as a measure of last resort, like following what Mike was saying at the beginning. But we also support regular monitoring by independent bodies of the conditions and treatment of migrants deprived of liberty as one of the key measures to prevent the risk of torture and ill treatment in detention. And in this regard, DPT has developed a series of tools and resources, including practical manuals to monitor immigration detention that are available on our website. So today we are joined by a great group of panelists who will be walking us through the topic of monitoring migration-related detention in the context of the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture, or OPCAT, as we say. And we will explore the role of NHRIs and civil society working on immigration-related issues, in relation to the OPCAT. So the role of NHRIs and civil society is key at different stages, is key in raising awareness and advocating for ratification of the OPCAT when it is not ratified yet by the states. But once it is ratified, these bodies, civil society and NHRIs, can also be involved in the process of establishing a national preventive mechanism. And then some NHRIs are established as national preventive mechanisms. But then there is a whole interaction once the NPM is in place. So the interaction that you can have with NPMs can range from full-fledged collaboration on joint initiatives and projects, including by being part of the NPM, or also advising the NPM, to also playing a watchdog role towards the work of the NPM and towards the implementation of the OPCAT as a whole. So without further remarks, let's go straight to the first session of this event, where our two distinguished speakers will introduce the OPCAT and its bodies, the SPT and the NPMs. So the presentations, as was mentioned at the beginning, will be followed by a Q&A session where you can address specific questions to the panelists. And for a matter of time, I will just briefly introduce our speakers by their name and affiliation. So let's start with the first speaker. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Sir Malcolm Evans, Professor of International Public Law at the University of Bristol and former SPT chairperson. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Veronica, and thanks to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak briefly with you this morning, afternoon rather, and to have the opportunity of answering questions shortly. Inevitably, time is short, and this is meant to be something of a introduction to what the OPCAT is and how it bears upon immigration detention. I'm conscious that very many people participating in this call will know much of what I'm about to say, but there may very well be others who do not. And I think it is important to both help those, but to remind ourselves about some key aspects of the OPCAT system at the outset of this seminar, because it's very important to do so, because sometimes we forget some of the basics about what we are all about. And the OPCAT is, oddly, one of the least well-known of the UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, and yet in many ways it is one of the most powerful. We still tend to speak about the OPCAT as if it's a relatively new body. Well, it may be one of the latest of the adopted UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, but it is now hardly new. It entered into force in 2007. So it has over 15 years work under its belt in these fields. And I know in UN terms, people say things take a long time, but I do rather take the view that 15 years of work is a substantial period of time to be operating, on these issues. And the three key ideas, which we always must remember when we are talking about OPCAT and what makes it so distinctive, is that it is based on prevention rather than in responding to breach. It is based on a preventive methodology, which is based on visits to places of detention. And that, as Mike in his introduction has already emphasized, what is very unique about it is that it is an integrated mechanism operating both at a national as well as an international level. Now, I just want to pause there very briefly, because understandably, it is often suggested that, well, yes, there is this distinction between the national and the international, and it is the SPT, the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, which I'll be saying a few more words about, which operates at the international level, and the NPMs, the National Preventive Mechanisms, at the national. Well, that's not entirely true. Of course, that may be where their chief focus of activity lies, but the SPT has always understood the OPCAT as offering an integrated system, And so the national mechanisms do form part of the overall international umbrella of protection, which OPCAT puts in place. And likewise, the role of the SPT is not only to operate at the international level or descend into the domestic when it undertakes its visits, but to be working alongside the national mechanisms on a systemic basis as they go about doing their job. And so I do think it's important to stress that although, yes, it operates at the national and the international level in their own and different ways, both elements, the NPMs and the SPT, do both. They both work nationally and they are both part of that broader international system. Now, all these three things operating at different levels, prevention and visits to places of detention, are really not in themselves potentially new. These things have taken place in many countries for many years. But bringing them together in this way is new, and it is the particular job of the OPCAT to do that and to provide a framework for that. 91 states are now party to the OPCAT, so that's getting on for half the number of countries in the world. And very many of them have now established the national preventive mechanisms, which we'll be hearing more about from my colleague Hinpal shortly. At the international level, just to remind us, the SPT is also the largest of the UN human rights treaty bodies with 25 members, and it is unique within the UN system because of the scope of its mandate. The mandate that the SPT has and the legal basis for its work is something which no other UN body has. And it is so important that we appreciate that if we are going to get out of it what it can actually deliver in the field of immigration detention. The mandate and practice. It is unique because it gives the right to visit any place where it, and I stress that, where it, the SPT, and indeed therefore the NPMs, believe that persons may be deprived of their liberty on the basis of public authority. Now, for the SPT, this applies to any place under the jurisdiction and control of the state's parties, because that's what the OPCAT says. It means that the SPT and the NPM can access any part of any facility, see any documentation it wishes, and meet in private any person, including staff, this is sometimes forgotten, as well as detainees with whom it wishes to speak. And of course, as you will know, following reports, its visits, it will give immediate feedback, issue a confidential report, if it is the NPM and SPT. NPM's reports do not have to be confidential, but even the SPT reports can be made public by the state, and I'll be alluding to some of those in a few minutes. But then, after issuing its reports with its recommendations, there should be ongoing dialogue around those recommendations. What could or should be done to make it less likely that detainees are subject to ill treatment? And it is so important that the reports are, where possible, made public so that more people can be drawn into the dialogue that surrounds the recommendations that follow a visit. And this particularly ties in with the point that's already made about the potential role of civil society. Now, the SPT has undertaken around 80 such visits around the world and has helped establish NPMs in so many of these countries. What I really now want to do very briefly, and we'll have time in questions, is to focus a little on what the SPT has done in the field of immigration detention. Now, for some, SPT and NPM work is largely about policing and prisons. As everyone on this seminar will know, this is not true. I've already said any place where persons may be detained. But what are the implications of this? Well, on the basis of this, SPT has visited already many immigration detention centres and indeed hostels for asylum seekers, which we understand may not be formal places of detention, but there has been questions about whether de facto detention has been occurring in those places. And that is something that can also fall within the OPCAT mandate. to make sure that something in effect that may be a place of detention is not being used in that way. What do we mean by detention? Well, once again, the SPT and the OPCAT take a very broad approach to this. People already ask, well, what does it mean? Does it include immigration detention, administrative detention? It's all quite simple. For the SPT, detention simply means if you are not free to leave. So it is not only those who are formally in detention, and that is hugely important when we think of the field of immigration detention and the processes that surround that. It means that the role of NPMs and indeed the visiting mandate of the SPT do not and are not limited to officially designated sites. So any ad hoc or temporary holding facilities are also covered. On this basis, the SPT has visited both large detention centres, initial reception facilities at point of entry. It has visited aircraft holding units, holding facilities at major international railway stations, as well, of course, as prisons and police stations, which are used for immigration detention purposes, even though they are not in principle meant to be. We've also sought to monitor some of the processes of immigration detention and of removals. Unlike the CPT, the SPT has not yet monitored a return flight, but there is no doubt that it could do so if it wished. And of course, NPMs currently routinely do so in some countries. It's also worth saying that the SPT has also had the treatment of migrants at sea in its sight. And whilst it has not undertaken work actually at sea, there is no question in my mind that this falls within its mandates too. And I can say that the SPT has certainly contemplated doing this. It has also done so in all parts of the world. And I may make particular mention here of the Regional Processing Centre in Nauru, which I led a delegation to some years back. It did this on the basis that Nauru was a state party to the optional protocol at the time of the visit. I think it would equally have taken the view that had Australia been a state party at that time, it may have been entitled to do so on that basis as well. This is important. Detention monitoring under OPCAT relates to those under the state's jurisdiction and control, or those who it feels may be under the jurisdiction and control of the state, irrespective of where that is taking place. If persons are held abroad under an arrangement with a third country, then they must be subject to OPCAT preventive monitoring. This is the case where sentenced prisoners are held on behalf of a state in a third country, and it applies to immigration detention too. Obviously, non-refoulement obligations apply, so a state cannot export migrants to other countries without OPCAT guarantees being in place. Moreover, it has long taken the view that it is impermissible for an OPCAT state party to return persons to a country where there is no effective oversight of places of detention, where there is a real risk that that person will be detained and potentially subject to ill treatment. And above all, the SPT has stressed on numerous occasions that immigration detention per se is simply wrong. To that extent, I think we have already been doing what Mike in his regards urges that we should be thinking of doing. Because, you know, it really does fall within the remit of effective prevention. A few more moments before I finish, I will just like to mention some of the key issues that we have discovered in the course of immigration detention. Prolonged use of completely inappropriate police facilities, revolving door re-detention at the end of maximum periods of detention, the use of highly militarized facilities, often more so than prisons, very unclear or opaque legal frameworks, a chronic lack of information or access to advice and support for those in immigration detention, all of which fall within the mandate. And then, of course, there are particular issues concerning children in immigration detention, where a whole host of additional issues arise, including, of course, systems of age verification. Finally, the role of civil society, I do want to finish by highlighting the vital work that civil society does, critical for the support of those in detention, but also as a source of information for bodies such as the SPT and NPMs, and for the following up on their recommendations and continuing oversight through awareness raising and advocacy for change. My time is over. There is a Q&A. What I would say is that it is so important to explore what can be done through the OPCAT framework, as it does have such an enormous potential to assist in immigration detention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Malcolm Evans. I think you greatly covered and provided an overview really of the treaty and the SPT as a treaty mechanism. So there are already some questions for you. So I think there will be opportunity to dig more on certain aspects that you already touched upon, like especially on the role of civil society regarding the SPT, in particular, specifically to visits. So we'll see that afterwards. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our second speaker for this first session, Mr. Hinpal Bui. Hinpal is inspection team leader at Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons for England and Wales, and he's also visiting professor at the Oxford University. So Hinpal, without further delays, the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Malcolm. It's a really useful overview which you've given. So it's great to see so many people attending this seminar from all over the world, and thanks to the GDP for organising yet another important event. I'm really pleased to be here, really interested in a discussion which we're going to have later on. I'm going to make some brief points about NPMs, their powers, the challenges that they face, and what they can achieve within, what can sometimes be quite limited and limiting national contexts. Mike's already highlighted some of the concerns that I wanted to address. I will speak generally rather than going into detail about individual countries, because I'm sure that other speakers will say how they exercise their powers and the extent to which they feel they can meet the promise of NPMs. But I'll try to talk a little bit around Mike's challenge about how NPMs can perhaps lead to work on deeper reforms of immigration detention rather than just making small changes which may not address some of the fundamental human rights concerns that immigration detention raises whenever we discuss it. So first of all, on powers and functions, again, Malcolm's talked about these a little bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but I think the important point here is that while states ratify OPCAT and obviously have the responsibility for setting up NPMs, from then on, NPMs are intended to be functionally independent bodies, which can help states to meet their human rights obligations. They should have a separate guaranteed budget and be able to appoint their own staff. And OPCAT sets out other requirements for NPMs, which are really quite important. And they include that NPMs have staff with the expertise they need to monitor detention properly. That's contingent, of course, to some extent on them having resources. The state should give them access to information on numbers of detainees and their locations, and any relevant data on their treatment and the conditions of detention. NPM shouldn't be obstructed from entering sites of detention. And once there, they should be able to have private interviews with detainees, going wherever they want and speaking to whoever they want. The state is then obliged to consider the NPM's recommendations, engage in discussion about implementation, and very importantly, ensure publication at least of their annual report. Publicising findings and providing some transparency about what happens in detention is, I think, a critical part of the NPM's role. NPMs can also review and comment on existing or draft laws relating to deprivation of liberty. And that means they have a chance to influence policy before it's implemented, another very important role. But NPMs are meant to achieve all of this through encouraging and cooperative means. I think this is sometimes forgotten. To be clear, this doesn't mean that they can't be very critical of states if they need to be, but the starting point is an attempt at constructive discussion and influencing is the way forward. Now, taken together, this means that in theory, at least, NPMs have a powerful mandate which can genuinely help them to expose what's happening in places of detention and push the authorities to make changes. Not surprisingly, these powers can lead to some tensions between NPMs and governments. In effect, OPCAT requires states to fund an organisation which is then allowed to be critical of the state. This means that NPMs have to be agile, they have to be diplomatic, and they have to work out the best way of getting their recommendations implemented. Again, to stress, this doesn't mean they can't be very clear and critical, but I think they have to think very carefully about how they can best get across their messages. For that reason, NPMs are unlikely to challenge the state's decision to detain people in the first place. My own NPM doesn't have a direct remit to challenge the decision to detain, but is very critical of conditions within detention. So unless they have a particularly receptive and sympathetic government, NPMs won't be dealing directly very often with the main priority of many campaigning organisations, which is to stop immigration detention altogether. So in this context, what's the value of NPMs? They've been criticised very heavily, sometimes for effectively endorsing more use of detention by encouraging small and potentially insignificant improvements in the wider context that don't reach the threshold of what could be considered acceptable against human rights standards, such as those of the CPT. At worst, they can be accused of providing human rights window dressing for states that have no intention of implementing their recommendations, and therefore their very existence can delay the deeper reform which many people think is needed. So a few points I want to make on this. First of all, NPMs occupy a unique position between the state and civil society, and they need both to understand and to push the limits of that role, but they should not, in my view, easily go beyond it and start to campaign against detention in the same way that they shouldn't allow themselves to be fully absorbed by government and compromise their independence as a result. There are already plenty of groups filling the campaigning space, and I think to lose the distinct contribution of NPMs will be incredibly short-sighted. Instead, I think NPMs should look to occupy that in-between space with some energy, because there is more power potentially and influence in that space than on either side of it. Either side of the space is already crowded with NGOs, campaigning groups, and state audit mechanisms. While governments can't provide independent oversight of detention, NGOs don't have the access to detention that would allow them to understand what is happening inside in the kind of detail that NPMs can. So providing detailed evidence, by providing detailed evidence, NPMs can allow others to see crucial data. That's useful both for governments that want to improve conditions and also for NGOs that want to challenge detention. And they make sure that the public knows what is happening in their name. Again, a very important role for an NPM. But independence doesn't mean detachment. In the same way that they can engage government in constructive and challenging dialogue, NPMs can also learn from NGOs that may have far more experience and expertise than they do, and use the intelligence they provide, use the expertise they provide, and support them to do the job of monitoring detention where NPMs perhaps don't have the resources or the capability to provide. And where there's a dovetailing of objectives of NPMs and NGOs, this can, I think, create concerted positive pressure towards change. And just to give you one quick example, in the UK, a series of detailed reports by parts of the NPM on children's detention provided much of the evidence that was used by lawyers and NGOs to campaign for reform, and that eventually led to greatly reduced detention of families and much better conditions for them. They're still in detention, but the detention conditions are better and there are far fewer of them. So I think that is a positive outcome. So in theory, NPMs have a lot of influence in promoting positive change and can redress to an extent the power imbalance between detainees and the state. They're even more important in immigration detention than prisons, because it's often the case that across the world, immigration detention tends to be more hidden from view than criminal detention. And very often it's in the worst condition, people are held in worse conditions in immigration detention than they are in prisons. And regulation is often worse as well. The degree to which they can succeed depends on political willingness to listen to NPMs and also to their own commitment to exercising their powers. The argument that they might delay deeper reform is not particularly strong in my view, because, well, partly because only by knowing what's happening inside detention in the first place can we get into debates about the legitimacy of that detention, and partly because telling the story of what happens on the inside by giving voice to detainees and gathering empirical evidence, can we do the important job of challenging the objectification of detainees and exposing some of the injustices that can occur at each stage of the immigration process. So whatever their current flaws in many countries, I think that without NPMs, we will potentially have potentially have no pathway towards progress, but with NPMs, at least we have some information which otherwise that wouldn't be provided to help NGOs and others to campaign for reform and to move the agenda, move the debate forward somewhat. I could go on, but I think I'll just stop there. I realize I'm running out of time.
Thank you very much, Hinpal, for this overview about the NPM's role, powers, challenges, but also I think you made some very interesting points that we can discuss now in the session, in the Q&A session, about also the distinctive role of each of these bodies. I wanted to really thank the first two speakers, Sir Malcolm Evans and Hinpal Bui, for their great introduction presentations. And now I will leave and give the floor to Rachel to moderate the part on the Q&A. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and Sir Malcolm and Hinpal. We have one question in the Q&A right now, so please do feel free to add some questions for either Sir Malcolm or Hinpal, or for both of them. But our first question is from Sahar Okrivat from the Refugee Council of Australia, who is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Global Detention Project. Her question is to Sir Malcolm Evans, and she says the SPT is scheduled to visit Australia later this year, and she's wondering, from your perspective, Sir Malcolm, what is the best way for NGOs to engage with the SPT prior and during its visit to ensure the maximum impact after it leaves? So can you address that one, Sir Malcolm? And then please do, if you have other questions or you want to raise your hand, please do so. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I could say that the person who you will be hearing from later possibly is in a better position than I to answer this question, being Stephen Caruana, who will be speaking from Australia, who for some while now has been heading up the most remarkable example of how civil society and other actors can get together in order to assist OPCAT related processes through the OPCAT network, which has been established in Australia. And I know that they have already been doing a great deal of work to help prepare for this very, very, very much delayed SPT visit. You know, the SPT was due to be visiting Australia, and indeed I was due to be leading the delegation to Australia back in, I think it was April 2020, before the pandemic struck and meant that all such work had to be put on hold for a very long time. I still feel sorry that I'm no longer a member, going to be able to be participating in that visit, but I know that from all visits, the things that are most important to the SPT are the opportunity to get real insights in advance of a visit from all quarters, including civil society, of what their perceptions of the key core underlying questions might be, to prime them as best they can on how to really probe, to make best use of the very limited amount of time, regretfully, that the SPT has available when it's undertaking its own visits. Rightly, in the context of the visit to Australia, I imagine much focus will be placed on the progress towards the much delayed establishment of the National Preventive Mechanism. I know Australia is now once again fast approaching the legal buffers on the time when it needs to get it in place. And it is right that that is the case. But it is also so important that it is also able to visit places of detention, raise the relevant issues, and civil society can help it do that. Finally, of course, after the visit, and has already been said, there is a hugely important role for civil society in awareness raising about the visit, the aftermath of the visit, and if and when they become available, continuing the argument and advocacy for the implementation of recommendations. So, a great deal that can be done, useful in advance, but equally useful and important afterwards.
Thank you so much, Sir Malcolm, for that very comprehensive answer. I hope that helps, Sahar, in your preparation for the SBT's visit to Australia. I have two questions from Alice Bloomfield, who's from the ICRC, is a migration and asylum specialist with the ICRC. One for Hinpal and one for Sir Malcolm. So Hinpal, Alice thanks you for your presentation and says, do you see an added value in confidentiality for the work of the NPM in its dialogue with the state? And I'll let you answer first, Hinpal, but then a question from Sir Malcolm is, could you talk a little bit more about the potential role of the NPM in return processes? What is the basis for it? Where and at what stage of return processes? So a question for both of you. Let's start with Hinpal, please.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. That's a good question. And my basic view is that while confidentiality sometimes might be useful, I think that NPMs should take great care before entering into confidential discussions with states, partly because of what I said earlier about how important publicity is to the work of the NPM. Making sure that everyone understands what's happening in detention is a critical role that NPMs can play. Now, there could be circumstances where both are taking place. There may be some important concerns which NPMs have, which are going to cause great embarrassment to the state, which may lead to, maybe a loss of resource or a loss of support for the NPM, which mean that the NPM needs to be more diplomatic in the way that it addresses those concerns. That's fine, but I think to have entirely secretive conversations with states will be really quite problematic for NPMs. And I think that there have been situations, there are other organizations which provide confidential information. So the SPT, for example, as an overarching body, provides confidential information. The ICRC provides, really important confidential information to states, and it helps them to make some changes. I think in the interlocking system of human rights protections, NPMs should be very, very careful to lose their power of publicity.
Thank you, Hinpal. So Malcolm, would you like to answer the question about return processes and the roles of NPMs?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just say, picking up on what Hinpal was saying, I think he's absolutely correct that I did mention in my presentation that it is the reports and dialogue of the SPT which has to remain confidential. And that isn't out of a matter of policy choice. That is because the optional protocol requires it. And we go out of our way to encourage publicity around these things where where possible, and the complementary nature that you can get by operating, shall we say, between what from us initially has to be in a confidential space compared to those that don't, is one of those points where one can mutually support and reinforce each other in different ways, in different venues, in achieving the same goal. So it's very important to note that is a key difference between the, if you like, the practices of those two different tiers. To move on to the question about how NPMs can assist. Well, in returns processes, in a sense, there are, to me, I suppose, two obvious things. The first is to be looking at, if you like, to be looking from a general policy perspective about the nature of the processes that surround this. One may feel that one is not in a position to challenge the policy itself, but making sure that the processes through which decisions are made and the operating procedures through which returns are actually effective are fully respectful of the rights of all those concerned, and also ensure that ill treatment does not take place, or the risk of ill treatment is minimized in those processes. Something that can be subject to prior scrutiny through ensuring that the assessment processes and the operating procedures and protocols are in place that are appropriate for the task that is to be undertaken. And then, of course, there is the matching business of the practice to ensure that that is actually done. But I would add that certainly from an SPT perspective, one of the things that's always concerned us is the ability to follow through on monitoring during returns processes. For example, I know that those who have been involved in monitoring, for example, international return flights, have spoken of their frustration at being able to observe persons being taken onto the flights, the removal from the planes, but not themselves being able to leave flights on arrival in third countries, and then literally not being able to see what's happening the moment they are literally out of eyeshot from an aircraft window. And that can be deeply troubling. And that is where good liaison with the NPM in a receiving state can go a long way to try to assist. And which is, again, one reason why I mentioned in my presentation that we have long taken the view that the preventive obligation on states which are states parties to OPCAT extends to ensuring that there are appropriate monitoring and oversight mechanisms in place which are OPCAT compliant in the countries of return. And so these are two, I suppose, key practical ways in which one can try to follow through on what we've been saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those very helpful responses on confidentiality and the return process. I have a question from Zor Win from APRIN, the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. And it's for Sir Malcolm, and his question really is, in countries that are non-signatories to the OPCAT but have ratified the CAT, how can NHRIs get access to immigration detention centres to collect reliable data and assess conditions in those centres? He's asking if you have any insights, suggestions, ideas for those countries. So non-signatories to the OPCAT, but they are signatories to the CAT. Thank you.
Well, of course, in one sense, the only thing that the OPCAT does is to provide the legal obligation that the CAT itself does not, to a greater degree of specificity. After all, if you're a state party to the CAT, will already have an obligation to prevent torture and ill treatment in accordance with Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture. And so at one level, you could say all that the OPCAT is doing is providing, shall we say, specifics to that generality. But even within that generality, the claim can rightly be made that if the state is going to be doing what it should be doing to prevent torture, then this is exactly the sort of information that it should be sharing, at least with already accredited national human rights institutions, to assist them in the doing of their job. And so whilst they cannot rely on such clear language and clear obligations as the OPCAT provides in relation to access to information for NHRIs designated as NPMs. I see no reason why one wouldn't be able to look to Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture to at least provide a slightly more generalized obligation to be doing something similar that could be drawn on and worked with. Because after all, if one's taking one's preventive responsibility seriously as a state, why would you not be willing to do that to assist those bodies already tasked with such a role outside the OPCAT framework from doing so?
Thank you. That was extremely helpful, Sir Malcolm, and I hope that helps, especially for your region of the world that APRIM is covering. I have a message from Sophia, a question from Sophia Soros to Sir Malcolm. She says it's great to hear your intervention and particularly your thoughts about how the SPT's involvement in situations at sea is perhaps inevitable. She asks if you could elaborate on how we can get state parties on board with the fact that the SPT and respective NPMs have the mandate to monitor potential sea rescues and pushbacks. So is someone being held against their will if their boat is simply being pushed back? And what are the jurisdiction questions surrounding it? I imagine this is going to be a lengthy answer, and we're running out of time. We've got about 2 more minutes for this session of question answers, but if you can briefly address that, and maybe Sophia, it's something you could follow up directly with Malcolm with, particularly on the jurisdiction questions issue afterwards. But it would be fascinating to hear your response to that, Sir Malcolm.
Well, this is a matter on, I suppose, quite strongly, because not many people will know that if I've spent much of my life working on torture issues, I've also spent most of my life also working on issues to do with the law of the sea, and the extent to which human rights are in fact respected and protected at sea is acquiring ever greater prominence. The short answer to your question, Sophia, is tell them. This is just part of the shall we say, the lack of thinking through of what the extent of the OPCAT obligation actually amounts to. If boats at sea are places where persons are being deprived of their liberty, then they fall within the operational mandate of the OPCAT. When they are doing so on the basis of state authority. And those who are detaining persons at sea clearly fall within that category. We have known for a long time that when people who are picked up at sea are being held for prolonged periods, there may be issues, for example, under the European Convention on Human Rights. There's the old Medvedev case and so on and so forth. More and more cases, both from the ECHR, but also under the Human Rights Committee, under the ICCPR, also are beginning to refer to issues of persons being rescued and potentially held at sea, or not rescued at sea, when de facto they are under the jurisdiction of the state, because they are the state able to exercise control over them at that given moment. And so the remit runs, it is more a question of thinking through what that means from a practical perspective from the NPM, what capability and capacity it has to be able to engage with this, for example, with Coast Guards or the equivalent agencies, and in practical terms, what this might look like. I'm not blind to the difficulties of doing this, but if it's possible to get oversight, for example, of customs infringements by having what are known as free rider agreements on board vessels, it's really not that impossible to gain a similar sort of situation where NPMs might be able to at least observe the way these things are handled, much as though they do on return flights. I think it's more a question of expanding the scope of imagination and making the case, rather than any particularly difficult legal hurdles that stand in the way of bringing this about.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer in a very short amount of time. Just before we go to Veronica, I do want to draw your attention to one very important comment in the chat, actually, from Michael Slobecki from the Polish NPM. And he talks about this very important situation of the irregular migrants crossing the border between Belarus and Poland, and draws to our attention that the Polish NPM managed to carry out more than 50 inspections in 2021 and 2022 of the border guard stations and immigration detention centers along that border. And for the very first time, they were actually present in the forests next to the border to monitor that all the safeguards have been in place from the first moment of detention, including, extremely importantly, non-refoulement safeguards. And they were the only body allowed to monitor in those border forest regions. And he's just bringing that to our attention to show us what a powerful instrument the OPCAT and NPMs can be in really crisis situations, as we saw on the Belarus-Polish border earlier this year and last year. So I thought that was important. We have run out of time. I do want to say that all our panelists have agreed to stay an extra 10 minutes at the end of this, because we anticipated there may be a lot of questions. So for those of you for whom it's not too late at night, if you want to stay, we will extend this by 10 minutes. But I'm going to hand back to Veronica for the second half of our webinar now. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who asked questions so far.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Sir Malcolm Evans and Hinpal. So I think it was a good transition to the second session in terms of questions and interventions from participants, because now the idea of the next session is really to look at the practical experience of national preventive mechanisms from different countries. We have 5 countries represented here today, and I think many of the questions that were posed to Malcolm and Hinpal, I believe our colleagues from those countries will also have experience, practical experience to share in terms of false returns, in terms of monitoring sea rescues and monitoring boats, actually. And so I think it will be a very interesting session. And I just remind our speakers that they will have a bit less time than the previous speakers, because we have quite a number of speakers in this session. So you have 5 minutes, and then we will still have a session of questions and answers. That so you will have more time to add some other considerations, I think, to your presentation. So the first speaker on my list for this session is our colleague Marko Anojcic. So Marko is the independent advisor at the National Preventive Mechanism of Serbia. So Marko, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Veronica. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you Global Detention Project for letting me present work of mine and my colleagues and the Serbian NPM in this particular topic. I have a presentation which I will share right now. In my brief presentation, I will try to present you these topics. Something about structure of the NPM of Serbia. You can see here a little bit from history, but the main thing here to remember is that we are established in 2011. In December last year, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary. We are established on the Ombudsman Plus model. That means that Protector of Citizens, which is Ombuds institution in the Republic of Serbia, execute the mandate of the NPM in cooperation with autonomous provinces, ombudsman institutions, and civil sector. How is this practically operationalized? That means that within Protector of Citizens, we have special unit department of the NPM, which perform NPM activities and is directly responsible for the Deputy Protector of Citizens in charge of persons deprived of the liberty and the NPMs. With regards to autonomous provinces ombudsmans, we currently cooperate with the ombuds institutions from autonomous province of Vojvodina, which is in the north of the country. And regarding CSO, they are selected by the public call every 2 years. Criteria for the selection is broadly set. As you can see, quality and quantity of activities, reports, and publications. We use civil society organizations for experts, which they provide us. Their representatives are experts in different fields of interest of NPM. And in the last paragraph, you can see the names of the CSO we are currently cooperating with. After the selection process, we conclude cooperation agreement with each selected organization, which stipulates in which activities of the NPM they will participate. As you can see, that's basically all the activities. I also extracted here some important, well, not main, important parts of the cooperation agreement. I wish to point out here that they are paid for their activities in accordance with the special act of the Protector of Citizens. In practice, that means that they are paid by 1 page of the report and 1 hour spent in the visit to detention, place of detention. When it comes to a provisional ombudsman institutions, we have a memorandum of cooperation, which is basically pretty much the same like the cooperation agreement with CSOs, but with some differences. The participation of the provincial ombudsman representative bear all costs of its activities, so they are not paid by us. And the memorandum of cooperation is concluded for an indefinite period. So there is no public call and everything else which is linked to participation of CSOs. Now I would like to present you briefly about the context of the immigration detention in Serbia. When we speak about places of detention, we found several types of them. Firstly, we have 3 shelters for foreigners. They are under Ministry of Interior. You can see here short information about each of them, but it is important to remember that they are closed type institutions for foreigners who need to be forcibly removed from the country, and that is often done in accordance with the readmission agreement and always to a neighboring country of their citizenship or their third country citizens. I have some pictures from the newly renovated shelter for foreigners Ipadiska Skela, which is near Belgrade, capital of Serbia. Besides shelter for foreigners, we have 3 international airports with premises for the accommodation of foreigners who have been denied entry into the country. As you may know, placement in these premises can amount to the deprivation of liberty in some cases. We have 8 regional border police centers for 7 neighboring countries. There is no data that police custody is applied here, although the law of foreigners provides for this possibility. But during the visits to these police stations, we found migrants which were brought into police stations for different reasons and held in bad conditions, as you can see here. Shortly about NPM visits. We use common methodology for visits as the all NPM do, since those places of immigration detentions are smaller and their organizational structure is simplified in comparison with psychiatric institutions or prisons. Our visits are also shorter, and our methodology is more or less simplified. In the last paragraph here, you can see usual topics we cover during our visits to this kind of detention. I just want to mention that besides these places in Serbia, there is 18 centers for the accommodation and care of migrants and refugees, and 4 social care institutions for unaccompanied minor migrants, but they are not detention, since they are open type institutions. The other field of activities of the Serbian NPM, besides visits to places of detention, immigration detention, is forced removal, monitoring.
Marco, sorry, just if you can wrap up a bit, we are.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Sorry.
Thank you. We are performing these activities since 2019, and on this slide you can see numbers about these activities from the start. And for the end, I want to point out a couple of good practices of cross-border cooperation. In 2015, both Serbian and Croatian ombudspersons visited Serbo-Croatian border in order to check the treatment of migrants there, and this event had good media coverage. The second example, I want to point out that we had written cooperation and communication with our colleagues from Bulgarian ombudsman in several cases with foreigners who were forced return to Bulgaria complained or expressed concerns on how they'll be treated in Bulgaria. And for the end, I really want to point out that there is a big need to greater cross-border cooperations among NHRIs and NPMs, since this cross-border nature of human rights violations in connection to migrant status. Thank you for your time. I will be here till the end for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Marco. If you can, yes, thank you so much, and sorry for interrupting. We are now going to the next speaker, who's Massimiliano Bagaglini. Massimiliano is the head of the unit of the Prevention of Liberty and Migrants at the National Guarantor of the Rights of Persons Deprived of Liberty, which is the Italian NPM as well. So Massimiliano, the floor is yours, and also remind you about the time so that we can have a bit more time for discussion. Thank you, Massimiliano.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you to the organizers for inviting us to these important initiatives. Obviously, it's difficult to condense the subject in a few minutes. I will try to use the time available to give you an idea of the main lines of intervention of the Italian NPM in the field of administrative detention. And I will conclude with what I believe it is a good practice for the OPCAT system. The Italian NPM began to operating 6 years ago and immediately equipped itself with an organizational unit, as you said, responsible for monitoring situations of deprivation of liberty in the context of administrative migrant detention. And since then, he has been making regular visits to places dedicated to the administrative detention, which in recent years has seen a phase of expansion, primarily through the growth of the network of facilities. It has gone from 4 in 2016 to 10 today. The main critical issues verified after the visit concern mainly the lack of an organic law that regulates life within the CPR, the Center for Repatriation, introducing effective guarantees. Second one is the systematic deficiencies in the protection of the right of health of detainees. Third, the degraded material conditions of the living spaces. Fourth, the total absence of social activities and opportunities to use time in a useful way. Fifth, the unjustified practices of limiting the freedom of telephone correspondence. Sixth, the difficulty of access by organized civil society for the implementation and support and assistance initiative inside these centers. And last but not least, the lack of accountability and transparency of these facilities, the lack of a recording system of critical events, for example. The expansion in Italy of the administrative detention system then resulted in the identification of new places of detention. From October 2018, in fact, it was possible to detain foreign citizens subjected to a repatriation measure within the premises of the police headquarters in the cities, of a maximum of 4 days, and at the airports for a maximum of 2 days. The latest survey carried on by the National Guarantor, the Italian NPM, December 2021, indicates the presence in the national territory of a total of 44 police stations that have the availability of these environments. We visited last year and this year 5 police stations. The main problem encountered during these visits is similar to the problem encountered in visiting the Center for Repatriation: lack of precise parameters for identifying the structures, the inadequacy of material conditions, the absence of an explicit regulation of the condition of detention, and the consequent failure to recognize the guarantees and fundamental rights of this person by virtue of an administrative measure, in particular in the matter of the freedom of telephone correspondence, the information in understandable language on rights and obligations of the person detained, on the right of defense, on the right to seek international protection, on the right to receive health care. And finally, the lack of transparency, again, the lack of transparency and accountability of these places. But the activity of the Italian NPM did not stop at the codified places of deprivation of liberty, and has also pushed its visit activity to other places that in practice are configured as de facto places of deprivation of liberty. We visited hotspots, community for unaccompanied foreign minors, rescue ships without point of safe, quarantine ships, airport waiting rooms for person with a refusal of entry. These are extremely different situations and conditions which share the fact that the material execution of a restrictive measure in such places has no clear legal basis. Another important activity is the exercise of the consultative prerogative assigned to the NPMs. Our website contains the opinions that the guarantor, the Italian NPM, has formulated on the subject of administrative detention to the Parliament for the formation of the new laws about this matter. And I limit to recall that we obtain the reduction of the maximum period of detention from 6 months to 3 months in the repatriation centers, and the introduction of a judicial verification of the refusal of entry that were carried out directly by the hotspot. I'm going to conclude with sorry, Veronica. What I consider a good practice in the strategy of monitoring forced return. The last 7 March of 2022, the National Guarantor, the Italian NPM, signed a cooperation agreement with the Georgian NPM to establish a mechanism, a relay mechanism in monitoring forced returns, in order to extend observation to post-handover phase, and therefore guarantee greater protection to foreign nationals who have been repatriated. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano, for your presentation and for explaining the mandate of the NPM of Italy, also some developments in terms of your the scope of your work. So now let's go to the next speaker. So I'm very pleased to introduce Habibe Kara. She is a human rights and equality expert at the Human Rights and Equality Institutions of Turkey, the NPM of Turkey. Habibe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Veronica, and hello, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Global Detention Project for hosting this significant webinar, which provides a valuable forum for both NPM and civil society representatives. And also, I wish to thank all participants for their valuable contributions and for sharing their experience. Since I have a very limited time, in my speech, I will give some brief information about the institution, about the Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey, and mention the institution's activities directly related to the monitoring immigration detention centers. And finally, I will talk about the current practices in terms of cooperation and engagement with the civil society. Turkey signed the OPCAT in 2005 and ratified it in 2011. And the former Human Rights Institution of Turkey was designated as the NPM through a cabinet decree in 2013. But as a further step, in conjunction with the adaptation of the law on Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey in 2016, the NPM function of the institution gained a legal basis. Our institution has three main functions actually, and it acts as the NHRI, National Human Rights Institution, equality body, and also as the NPM. In addition to duties stemming from the OPCAT, the institution has also the duty of examining the individual applications filed by the persons who are deprived of their liberty. And as the NPM, monitoring the conditions in the immigration detention centers is one of the main fields of activity for the institution. In Turkey, recently, there are 30 immigration detention and accommodation centers, 2 of which are temporary. And as of August 2022, the number of foreigners hosted in these centers is more than 150,000 actually. Since 2018, our institution has visited 24 immigration detention and accommodation centers, and some of these visits were follow-up visits. And in 2022, 5 immigration detention centers were visited by the institution. Our visit reports are shared with the public through the institution's website. And in addition to visit reports, our institution has also published several thematic reports regarding the rights of migrants and refugees, such as a report on pushback activities against migrants, and also a report on the deportation of immigrants, and also the principle of non-refoulement. But by also drawing upon the findings from monitoring visits, the institution, in collaboration with all stakeholders, aims to protect and promote human rights in all detention centers, including immigration detention centers, through the raising awareness activities. And in this regard, it has provided several training programs on human rights and prevention of torture and ill-treatment for the administrators and personnel of immigration detention centers, and also for the gendarmerie personnel. And the institution attaches a great importance to cooperation with existing monitoring mechanisms, and also with the relevant non-governmental organizations. And in this regard, it has signed several memorandum of understanding with other NPMs, and also with 16 universities in Turkey, and lastly, the Union of Turkish Bar Associations. Joint visits have been carried out in a close cooperation with regional organizations such as Council of Europe and other NPMs to immigration detention and accommodation centers. Furthermore, attention is paid to the representation of all stakeholders, including civil society, in our events such as the symposiums, workshops, or seminars which are organized by the institution. As such, civil society representatives are invited as both speakers and also participants at these events. In addition, Human Rights and Equality Institution of Turkey has held several consultative meetings with the participation of NGOs, unions, and social and professional organizations. And the inputs of civil society are considered while determining the visiting place and also during the pre-report and reporting processes. Accordingly, the activities of relevant NGOs are closely followed by the institution, and especially in situations that require instant reaction, the institution carefully considers the demands and calls of the NGOs in this direction. For instance, in the visit to the Izmir Harmandalı Removal Center was conducted upon the call of the Association for Solidarity with Refugees in 2022. Furthermore, representatives from civil society and bar associations are included in the visiting delegations. Also, in the visit reports, the institution has recommended recommended to the respective administrations to facilitate the visits of immigration detention centers by the civil society and bar associations. And finally, while the institution prepares annual and thematic reports, it conducts correspondence with the civil society working in the field, and their contributions, suggestions, or opinions are reflected in these reports. But despite all these positive aspects, unfortunately, like other NPMs, we are also facing some challenges in monitoring detention centers. But am I running out of my time?
Yeah, 1 minute more or
a
few seconds more.
And,
thanks.
Okay, Michael and Hintval have already addressed some of them, but in terms of Turkey, there have been approximately 9,000 detention centers in Turkey now, and according to the UNHCR's data, Turkey has been hosting the world's largest refugee population for years. So, and furthermore, as I mentioned, our institution has a broad mandate and huge workload as the NHRI equality body and also as the NPM. Therefore, we are facing some difficulties in monitoring such a large number of detention centers due to the lack of staff, sufficient staff in terms of both number and also experience. And I think in this regard, to overcome this challenge to some extent, at least cooperation with civil society becomes even more critical, and to benefit from the expertise of 9 NGOs working in the field, we seek possibilities for further collaborations and mutual support. And at the end of my speech, thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to elaborate on any questions that you may have during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Habibe. Thank you for your presentation and all the insights, and also for elaborating quite a lot on your cooperation and engagement with civil society. This is of great interest for our participants. So now I am introducing our fourth speaker of this session, Dr. Kwanele Pakati. So Dr. Kwanele is the NPM coordinator at the South Africa Human Rights Commission. So Kwanele, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Good afternoon to everyone. And firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to thank GDP for organizing this webinar. And without taking much time, I'll just jump straight to it. Firstly, South Africa ratified the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture in June 2019. Well, after at least more than 10 years of signing the OPCAT. And one of the conditions was that there should be a feasible and pragmatic NPM model. We then undertook some baseline studies, including a study to both the UK and Poland, to look at extrapolating some feasible and pragmatic elements to build into the NPM for South Africa. And our recommendation as the NHRI was that there should be a cooperative model constituted by pre-existing institutions, noting that one, coverage of all places of deprivation of liberty would at least not be a problem, but also in terms of resources, the NPM would be able to consolidate its resources as a unitary institution and be able to make sure that at least there is a wider protective environment for persons who may find themselves deprived of liberty. So the NPM is constituted by the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, the Military Ombud, the Health Ombud, as well as the NHRI, which also plays a coordinating function in addition to a functional role, especially in situations where there are gaps in coverage. So since the ratification, just briefly, what we've done, we've undertaken a baseline assessment to kind of like create a matrix that will give us an idea of the detention architecture, also draw some lessons for institutional building, but also to share more information with officials who are employed in such places of the existence of the NPM, its mandate and expectations. One of the most important things to highlight is the fact that on the basis of this pragmatic model, then the provisions of Article 24 were not invoked by South Africa. And from our context, the places where persons are deprived of their liberty include, but are not limited to, police stations, correctional centers, immigration detention centers, mental health institutions, and secure care centers where children in conflict with the law are detained. So lastly, on the NPM, since the ratification process and the establishment of the NPM, what we've been doing, we've been focusing largely on institutional building processes to ensure that we have an NPM that is fit for purpose, but also confirms to the OPCAT framework. Moving on to immigration detention monitoring, one point that I want to raise at this stage is the complexity of protecting persons or populations on the move. We all know here that the population is migratory in nature, and this leads to two methodological issues. Firstly, from a practical point of view, the question is, do you focus on individual complaints? But secondly, do you focus on systemic issues such as infrastructure, review of policies, etc.? So these are the kind of questions that we are faced with, noting the fact that immigration monitoring in South Africa predates the ratification of the OPCAT. And South Africa has one central immigration detention center with in the west of Johannesburg with a capacity of plus or minus 5,000 persons. And this is authorized in terms of the Immigration Act, and specifically in terms of Section 34 of the Immigration Act. Police officers as well as immigration officers are given the powers to arrest and detain a suspected illegal migrant, and also, however, the most important qualifier here is that only immigration officers can confirm the status of an individual. On the initial arrest, a person can be detained for 30 days. However, that period can be extended to a further 90 days if the Department of Home Affairs anticipates that they would not be able to deport that individual. And 90 days plus 30 days, it comes to 120 days maximum detention period that is allowed in terms of the Immigration Act. So this has been one of the points for contention that brought to litigation, strategic impact litigation that started in 2014, where here we must extend appreciation on the role of civil society. For instance, they brought a complaint to the Human Rights Commission on the prolonged detention of undocumented persons, but also that they are detained in excess of the 120 days that is allowed by the law. This then brought into practice really, or rather it catalyzed the kind of like monitoring of immigration detention centers in South Africa. And secondly, civil society has also been quite instrumental in providing expertise, for instance, in forensic psychiatry, Veronica, I'm going to stop here. And then if there are any questions, then I'll be more than happy to address those. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kwanele, and sorry again for interrupting. I'm happy to announce and introduce the last speaker of this session so that we can have a possibility for all the speakers to jump in and develop a bit more. I'm really aware that 5 minutes presentation is very short, so apologies for interrupting. Our final speakers of this session is Stephen Caruana. Stephen is the coordinator of the Australia OPCAT network and is also specialist advisor on immigration and OPCAT at the Australia Human Rights Commission. I just wanted to mention that I believe at the end of his presentation, we will also have the pleasure to hear from Ian Anderson, Australia Commonwealth Ombudsman. So Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, fellow panelists, GDP and attendees. Across Australia, there are several immigration detention centres, transit accommodations and alternative places of detention in each of our states and territories. However, responsibility for them rests solely with the Commonwealth Government, as does responsibility for our regional processing arrangements with Nauru and previously Papua New Guinea. According to official departmental figures, as of the 31st of May 2022, there were 1,402 people in immigration detention facilities around Australia, and the average period held in detention was 736 days. As of the 30th of June 2022, there are 112 people remaining on Nauru. Australia ratified the OPCAT in 2017, but postponed its obligations to establish an NPM until January 2022, in line with the provisions of Article 24 of the OPCAT. Given our federated system of government, this delay was to be used to negotiate the establishment of a multi-body NPM between the Commonwealth, states and territories, coordinated at the federal level by the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman. Despite our extended timeframe, the Commonwealth Government requested an additional year extension, which was granted by the Committee Against Torture earlier this year. Australia now has until the 20th of January 2023 to establish its NPM and will need to provide a progress report at the 75th session of the Committee Against Torture in October, as well as during the SPT's upcoming visit taking place just prior to this. As well as being coordinator, the Commonwealth Ombudsman was also designated the responsible NPM for federal places of detention in June 2018. Its remit includes immigration detention and places of detention under the control of the Australian Federal Police and Australian Defence Force. Its OPCAT jurisdiction, however, does not extend to the regional processing arrangements on Nauru, which, as Professor Malcolm Evans noted earlier, has been a topic of controversy. Since designation, the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman has worked progressively towards adopting an OPCAT lens to its existing monitoring work and its engagement with civil society. In 2020, the Ombudsman established the Civil Society Advisory Group to provide expert advice and guidance on its NPM work. The group has met 4 times and the office produces communiques following its meetings. Supplementing this formal cooperation with civil society are meetings with relevant and interested sector groups prior to inspections and a dedicated page on the Ombudsman's website providing regular updates and an OPCAT-specific contact form. Importantly, the Commonwealth Ombudsman's Office has continued to work on updating its inspection methodologies in line with its preventive human rights mandate, drawing on the experience and expertise of others, including Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, the New Zealand Ombudsman, Inspector of Custodial Services Western Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission and the APT. It has shown a commitment to the transparency that OPCAT requires through the publication of its inspection reports. Since designation, the Ombudsman's Office has published 4 periodic inspection reports and a statement during the height of the COVID-19 lockdowns in Australia. These reports have complemented those of the Australian Human Rights Commission and have often helped raise the profile of detention-related issues. For example, the Ombudsman and Human Rights Commission's observations on the use of mechanical restraints have been used as supporting evidence in strategic litigation by civil society currently before the federal court. As to the notion of the potential of NPMs to reduce the use of immigration detention that Michael spoke about earlier, it should be noted that the SPT in its concept of prevention paper states that the prevention of torture and ill treatment embraces or should embrace as many as possible of those things which in a given situation can contribute towards the lessening of the likelihood of risk of torture or ill treatment occurring. In this regard, NPMs are interested in the reduction of people in detention so far as it directly corresponds to a risk of ill treatment to which it finds evidence itself. In the context of the Australian immigration detention, the Commonwealth Ombudsman in its NPM role has made recommendations both directly and indirectly linked to a reduced reliance on detention, including decommissioning of the high security Blaxland compound at the Villawood Detention Centre, reducing the number of people in detention to minimize the risk of COVID-19 spreading across the network, and limiting the use of hotels as alternative places of detention. To conclude my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that we are very fortunate to have the Commonwealth Ombudsman, Mr. Ian Anderson, join us for this webinar, and I would like to provide him the opportunity to make some final remarks about the work of his office.
Please,
Thank
Ian,
you.
You have the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Veronica. I'm not sure if I don't think my camera's working, but look, thanks very much for the opportunity. Stephen's described the role of my office as national coordinator, NPM coordinator, but also as the NPM for Commonwealth places of detention. We also are part of the NPM for the Australian Capital Territory. So we have three particular roles with respect to OPCAT. I just want to say thank you to the GDP for organising the event, and we look forward to working with the GDP community in those roles. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Stephen, for sticking to the 5 minutes, really. Thank you so much to all the speakers for the very interesting insight on their work, the work of the NPMs, but also from Stephen, also to hear from more about the coordination among civil society and NHRIs on this issue towards establishment of a system, of an NPM system in Australia. So I just now pass the floor to my colleague Rachel for questions, and then so you can elaborate more on specific issues. So Rachel, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Veronica. And let me take this chance to thank you, Veronica, for moderating this so well. You didn't have an easy task. And thank you to all our speakers. I'm sorry that we restricted you so much in the time. Before I open this, I would really like to say, I know we have a few less attendees than at the beginning, but if you're a civil society organization or an NGO, and want to ask some of our NPMs a little bit more about their work and how they operate, or if you have a question for Sir Malcolm or Himple, please do. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to raise your hand, you can also just take the floor and ask a question. But we would really love to hear from you. And we did get one question from someone who said they were anonymous. And we'd love to know who you are. You had a question for Corneli about the NPM in South Africa. If you could just tell us who you are, then we can introduce you. So I'm going to actually give the floor to Michael, Mike, who had a question earlier, which was about CSOs, and maybe you'd like to lead off this session of questions and answers. As I said, if we do have a lot of questions, we will extend a little beyond 3 o'clock. Otherwise, we'll finish on time. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thanks. Thank you for the 5 speakers, and also to Himple and Sir Malcolm for their presentations earlier. The question I have, a lot of the initial question I had concerned what are some of the specific types of interventions that civil society groups can have when they seek to interact with NPMs or indeed the SBT. That we heard a lot about some of the ways in which there's synergy between the work, and there are efforts to get data and information as well. But I'm wondering if any of the NPMs who spoke, or if Himple or Sir Malcolm would like to address this, but are are there specific ways, thinking that there are members of the audience who may have not had an opportunity to really interact with any of these bodies, and maybe there'll be people out there who are just learning about them now. It may be useful to have something a bit more specific. What should there be an outreach with a specific secretariat? And it may be different from country to country. I'm aware of that, and it's probably the case, especially with the NPMs. But having something more specific may be helpful for the agenda today. And the second question I had was, going back to what I initially said when we began our seminar today, our webinar today, was what challenges do the NPMs face in trying to get changes that they suggest or encourage states to take actually implemented and maintained? As I indicated, some of the research we have been doing over the past year with the WHO seems to have indicated that in a lot of cases, NPMs, monitors, and NGOs and others are making lots of important suggestions to officials with respect to making reforms, and that those reforms never get made, and that it seems in many cases impossible to get a state to move. Are there specific kinds of issues that states seem more susceptible to addressing, or are there cases in which it's been very difficult to get a state to make changes? And relatedly, are there situations where it seems more apt to have a reform adopted? For instance, if it's a facility that's operated by the state, or perhaps one that's operated by a private contractor, are there differences in the way in which NPMs have seen success in their efforts to encourage reforms? Thanks.
I don't know if anybody wants to step in and answer either of those questions. The first one, generally, how can CSOs who haven't had experience of engaging with NPMs, do you have some advice for them? And the second one about how can you actually see impacts and outcomes and reforms? Do any of our NPMs want to answer the first one? Do any of you have any direct experience yourselves of engagement with civil society organizations or advice for civil society organizations? Steve, yes, and Marco does. Okay, let's start with Steve and then hand over to Marco afterwards.
Thanks very much. So I think I'm in a very unique position, having worked for an NPM, but also having led a civil society organization in Australia in regards to advocacy for the OPCAT. I think that it's a two-way street. I think from the point of view of NPMs, the role of an NPM isn't just about inspecting places of detention. They also have an educative role, which includes outreach to civil society to both get them to understand the OPCAT generally, but also to get them to engage with the NPM to provide information. So I think NPMs themselves should be proactive in their approaches to civil society, bearing in mind the need to maintain their independence, but they should be promoting their work, with whatever opportunities they can find, whether that's at universities, providing guest lectures, which some NPMs do, being involved in seminars and academic with academic institutions. So there's that part. I think on the other side of the equation, there is a real need for civil society, and particularly for different sectors of civil society, to join together to understand how OPCAT is an umbrella which goes across many forms of detention and therefore many advocacy groups. So you've got the elderly, you've got immigration detention, you've got prison reformers, etc. So I think there's a need for cohesion between those groups to present a united front in terms of their engagement with the NPM. But really, you just need to make those initial steps to approach the NPM, and things like this are really important for people who are just learning what the OPCAT is and what it can achieve. That's significant, a significant first step that people must get, and then getting in contact with the NPM, providing information about what expertise your organization can provide, what ways you can help promote the work of the NPM and expand on its recommendations. I think those are some of the important elements that civil society needs to consider. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's really helpful. And I think it's one of the main objectives of this event today is to encourage that exchange and interaction. And we will certainly be sharing with you the contact details of all the speakers so that if you do want to get in touch with an NPM from your country, that you're able to do that. Marco, I think you wanted to share some insights, and then Cornelia, and then Habibe. Thank you.
Yeah, well, now I can only compliment Steven because he got my point, because I already explained how we cooperate with civil society organizations, but besides that, we from time to time have meetings with CSOs which are not part of the NPM. During these let's say meetings or written communication, they provide us with important informations about situation in different places of detention which are under the NPM mandate. So NPMs cannot be everywhere and cannot know everything what is happening on the field. Especially migration topic is very fluid, and you don't know what's happening on the borders or in the airports and everything. So my advice to CSOs is find your local NPM, national NPM, write to them, engage with them, be proactive, initiate a meeting, and present what you think is a problem in the field of expertise you do. In this case, immigration detention, but many others. But be aware that NPMs are not complaint body. So we do not deal with individual complaints. That is something that Ombuds institution does. We rather consider this, how we call it, structural problems that could lead to torture.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Cornelia, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, thank you to Marco and Stephen. But just two lines there. Firstly, I think complementarity is very important, as well as building synergy between the work that the NPM does, and because there is huge expertise that resides within society. For instance, their proximity to the issues on the ground. The NPM is able to then leverage off the information at the disposal of NGOs and civil society organizations in different forms. But also NPMs are able to draw some lessons and look at trends insofar as the issues that that emerge in any thematic issue. And just one lesson from our side. For instance, we've been able to work with the Center for Child Law here in South Africa to conduct a follow-up to the UN Global Study on children deprived of their liberty. Obviously, we had to set some framework in place for our cooperation through an agreement. So there is room to create that complementarity aspect as opposed to running in parallel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Habibe, I think you wanted to also add about your experience in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I totally agree with the all panelists, and I would also recommend being proactive and really engaging with the monitoring detention centers to civil society organizations, because according to our experience, for people who are deprived of their liberty, especially for the migrants, it's really easier to reach the civil society organizations than reach the NPMs, because they don't have sufficient information about institutional system of the country or bureaucratic system of the country. So I think civil society organizations have a really important role in monitoring detention centers in this regard. And also, as I mentioned in my speech, we are using the findings, evidence, or reports of the NGOs in our works actually, and they are really valuable resources for our works. In this regard, I would encourage the civil society organizations to more engage with the monitoring detention system. Thank you.
Thank you. And then thank you, Habiba, very much. And in response to the second half of Mike's question about seeing actual outcomes as a result of your monitoring and reforms and things improving, I mean, do any of you have any success stories to share with us of how you had made an impact? And what would you see were maybe the elements of being able to make an impact, and how can civil society organizations also help you and support you in achieving change and reform? I don't know if anyone has any reflections on maybe the harder part of Mike's question, which is what we're all looking forward to. Mike, do you want to clarify? Cornelie, yes.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity once again. I think for us, the strategy has always been on exploring pragmatic measures for the protection of persons in detention at two levels. Firstly, immediate protection for individual complaints, but also at the second level, long-term protection through systemic change. And one of the most important changes that an NPM can bring is changing human behavior, firstly through on-the-ground presence, but also creating awareness of normative standards that regulate places of deprivation of liberty. This can be either at a domestic or international level. And just two examples. For instance, when we started monitoring immigration detention, we faced an increasing number of unaccompanied migrant children, and what we then, through constructive dialogue with the state, what we then introduced was the development of a system for age assessments and for officials, for instance, to adopt a protective and proactive cautionary assessment should they be of the view that a person is a minor, because one would have doubts. So that is in place from a structural point of view, and they are able to then rely on it. And also through policy development to address the increased vulnerability of special groups, for instance, gender non-conforming individuals, without a protective environment in place, then people are exposed to further risk. I think I will stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very helpful response, Cornelie. And unless anyone wants to add to Mike's questions, I do have a general question also from Sophia Soares, who's a PhD student at Bristol University, and she's a member of the UK NPM. She's asking about the necessity for relevant expertise on NPM visiting delegations. So if NPM and SPT members are visiting immigration detention facilities, is it necessary for them to have expertise on immigration in order to carry out these visits? And she said this is bearing in mind the separate standards that need to be adhered to in this type of detention as compared to other kinds of detention that they may also be monitoring. So we think that's quite an interesting question, and wonder whether any of the NPMs, or indeed Himpal or Sir Malcolm, whether you have views about the necessity for specific expertise in immigration detention in order to be able to effectively monitor those facilities. Would anyone like to step up to respond to this question? Yes, so Malcolm and Marco and Himpal and Steve. So we'll go in that order. Let's start with Sir Malcolm. Thank you.
I'm now rather regretting my enthusiasm. Sorry, is this coming through, Rachel? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. The screen's looking a bit different. I'm now rather really regretting my enthusiasm, given all the others wishing to comment on this. And it's a bit of an ambiguous answer, really. Obviously, expertise is hugely helpful, and particularly when one is looking for compliance with fine-grained standards, etc., and expectations. And experience comes in many ways. Partly, it is, knowledge of what one should be looking for, but it is also experience of what one sees. And I have to say, I've always been quite a, shall we say, a believer that the untrained eye is sometimes at least as powerful and penetrative as the trained eye. And I think sometimes, most of the experience that I've had speaking to many is that whilst those who may not have specific training may not see certain things that they ought to be attuned to or know how to respond to some of the things that they do, those whose perhaps training and experience is perhaps not so well developed or formed, nevertheless can play a hugely important role here, not least by sometimes asking questions and challenging assumed and accepted practices and approaches, which others who are more familiar with the fact that this is how things are done may sometimes not even think to ask and question. So without wishing in any way to, should we say, to denigrate the significance and the importance of particular expertise, and it's always, of course, good to develop it, I don't think that it is an absolute bar that people are, begin their involvement in this field from a low knowledge base. In a way, we all have to start somewhere. The issue is important, and getting that, shall we say, that other, shall we say, perspective brought into play to challenge some of the assumptions that all those in a system can over a time become normalized to, I think can be very important. So desirable, but I don't necessarily have never seen it as an absolute prerequisite.
Thank you. Marco, do you have a reflection on that question?
Yes, thank you. Well, specific expertise is one of the crucial things, let's say. You need to know when you monitor something or someone conduct, what are you looking for? And also when you compile a report, the report and the findings and the reasons, they have to make sense to the authority to which it's addressed. So how to achieve expertise of the staff? Because there is many topics NPM cover, it's impossible to have specific expertise in each of them. Of course, we are all, let's say, general detention experts, but in specific areas, it's impossible to know everything about every area. First, adequate recruitment of staff. From now on, 15 years after the OPCAT, NPM is now job. So adequate recruitment of staff, which the staff can be used from the different state authority bodies, which are already have expertise in different types of detention. Besides that, of course, knowledge, thanks to internet, is everywhere. There is many tools different organizations create that you can use in your practical work of detention monitoring. And also, as I mentioned, through our cooperation with different CSOs who has expertise in many different fields of detention, they complement us. So we have like one or two CSO who had previous many activities in migration and asylum. So that is very helpful for our practical work.
Thank you, Marco. It's very helpful reflections from your perspective. Himpal, we'd love to hear from you in response to this question, and also whether you had any thoughts about the questions that Mike raised earlier as well. It would be great to get your perspectives. Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Because I'm having a bit of trouble as well. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you and see you. Thank you. Yeah, great. So I mean, I think the first thing is that time and curiosity are incredibly important factors in effective monitoring. And I think sometimes one of the things which concerns me often is that NPMs don't seem to spend long enough in detention. So if you have time, I think that can compensate to an extent for a lack of expertise. Sometimes expertise can actually be unhelpful, because what it means is that you are very experienced in detention, you've been there a lot, and maybe you start to become inured to what you're seeing. And I think one of the things that we try to do in the Inspectorate of Prisons is to mix up people who've got lots of prison or detention experience and have other people who've perhaps got less experience, but they can see things maybe more starkly because of that lack of experience. The other point, though, is that you need to be credible, and you know, just echoing something which Marco has said, I think you need to be able to persuade authorities that what you are telling them is based on, you know, a real understanding of what's going on in the detention environment. So to give you an example, recently I was in an establishment, an immigration detention facility, which looked in many respects to be operating very well, very nice staff, relatively open environment within the confines of the centre. And that can sometimes seduce you into thinking that things are going quite well. Now, the reason we realised that things weren't going quite so well was because we had a very capable person who understood use of force inside out and looked at some recordings of use of force, asked the right questions, spoke to the right people, and got a really deep understanding of what was going wrong in the way that staff were managing difficult situations. And I think the other thing to remember is, because immigration detention is not particularly specialized when it comes to the detention world, staff themselves may not know what the standards are. They may not know how to use force effectively. They may not know a lot of other things that you'd expect anyone running a detention facility should know. So external expertise, I think, can bring in a lot of very helpful contributions to both the Human Rights Project and to the objective of making sure that you can promote, you know, useful, significant changes in the way that individual institutions are operating. I'm just trying to remember now what Mike's original question was, but I think it was something about the CSOs and, you know, encouraging them to be a part of the detention monitoring. And there are a couple of things I'd say in response to that. I think it's one of the most useful things and easy things an NPM can do to engage civil society, I think, is to simply tell them that you're in an establishment and try to get intelligence and then use it. So I think if, you know, as soon as you're going into any form of immigration detention, you know, why not have a list of relevant NGOs, civil society organizations, email them or contact them on Twitter or whatever, you know, somehow get the message out and make sure you've got that inflow of information which you can then use. The other thing which I think is really important about CSOs is that they can help you to understand what, they can help you to connect with people who may have left immigration detention. So, you know, one of the concerns about monitoring detention is that people who are currently held may be concerned about talking to you. They may be concerned about the impact of, you know, complaining on their cases. And so that inhibition may not give you as good a sense of what's going on in detention as it should do. But if you speak to civil society organizations who are often in contact with people
before, during, and after detention, I think you may be able to get a good sense of what's happening in that individual establishment by speaking to people who have been released from it. So I think that's quite useful. I think the other challenge Mike threw out, if I'm remembering correctly, was about effectiveness. You know, what about concrete results? You know, what if you're not being paid attention to? Well, it's really hard to measure effectiveness in immigration detention monitoring, as in prison monitoring, because how do you measure what you've prevented? How do you know what you've stopped from happening, which would have made the situation worse had you not been there? And the answer is it's very difficult to have that kind of measurement. So I think that's not a good reason for losing faith in what you're doing. There are also other ways to look at this, which is that, you know, rather than looking for progress from monitoring visit to monitoring visit, you know, try and have a longitudinal view of what's going on. And I think if you do that, then in some countries at least, you can see that monitoring has had a significant, if not substantial, impact on improving conditions, certainly improving the information available to people outside, but improving conditions within places of detention. That's certainly the case, I think, in the UK context, where things have got better. They're still not perfect by any means, but they've got a lot better from the time that I first started going into immigration detention about 20 years or so ago. So, yeah, I think that there's many reasons not to lose faith in the potential power of NPMs. And I'd say that we probably do need to find more sophisticated ways of measuring impacts, but that's always going to be quite difficult.
Thank you. You ended on a positive note, Himpal, and that's always encouraging. We really are running out of time, and unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to thank one of our panelists from the NPM in Italy who had to leave us. But Stephen, I see you have your hand up, and I'd like to give you the chance to speak before I hand over to Mike to close off this session. So just if you can keep it brief, Steve, but we would like to hear your final thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to echo what the other panelists said about expertise being desirable, but not always necessary. I think something that perhaps isn't as emphasized regularly is your interpersonal skills. And I think you can have expertise, but if you don't have interpersonal skills and you aren't able to relate to people in detention as well as staff, then your expertise can sometimes count for nothing. So I think it's important to have the right people when you're looking at the mix of who you send into immigration detention to do the monitoring work. And I'd also like to emphasize as well that with regards to expertise, that should also include expertise by experience. And I think there's a really strong movement for monitors to consider placing on monitoring teams people who are former detainees and have had lived experience. And I think that's done a lot more so in the psychiatric institutions than in many other monitoring circumstances. But as just a small example I've seen myself, you know, I've seen psychiatrists with expertise go in to do monitoring, and people detained not speaking to them because they represent oppressive psychiatric treatment, and therefore they don't see them as someone they can connect with, but they would rather speak to someone who is a peer, and in doing so, they're able to extrapolate a lot more information about their circumstances because they trust that person. So I think that's a very small example, but it's something to sort of demonstrate that expertise is important, but interpersonal skills and experience as well intermingled in that is something that all NPMs should consider. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We are getting, oh, sorry. Go on.
No, I just wanted to finish by saying that we had one more question that we haven't got time to deal with, but I do think it's a very important issue that was raised by Marco in his presentation about the value of cross-border collaboration and cooperation between NPMs. We don't have time for that, but maybe Marco, you could respond directly to Sophia on that question. But I think that closes now our time for questions and answers and discussion. And as Mike is raring to go. I'm going to hand over to Mike to close this session, and just would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists and all of you for attending and sharing this event with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And just, we're running late, so I'll keep this really brief. A couple points I'd like to make. One, a heartfelt thank you to all of the presenters today. I learned a great deal, and I'm sure many people in the audience did as well. And this leads to the second point, which is that I hope one of the messages that's come across today is that we have a lot of capable people that we can turn to in countries around the world, which are these NPMs. And I would hope that today, for many of the people in the audience who are involved in advocacy around immigration detention, this could serve as a call to action. We have people that are capable and have the opportunity to make a change, but as we've heard, they're busy. They often don't have a budget, they may be understaffed, and they have a lot of different issues that they look at. Immigration detention is only one of them. So picking up on Himpal's thought about time and curiosity are important aspects of NPMs for their effectiveness. I think for our part in civil society, we can help pique that curiosity by reaching out to them proactively, providing information that we may have, and that an event like this is really intended to help us recognize this fact and serve as a call to action for all of us. I'd like to just close with that thought, and also to give a special thanks to Veronica, who was very kindly offered or assented to become our moderator today, which was great because it was a very difficult job with people who had 5 minutes to go, and everyone stuck to it. And Veronica, you did an amazing job. So thank you very much. And thank you to everybody. I look forward to being in touch with all of you in the weeks and months to come. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, Mike. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.